December 24, 1944. The Ardennes forest was a cathedral of frozen pine and suffocating fog. The air did not just carry the cold. It carried the metallic tang of spent cordite and the rhythmic, heavy thud of artillery that seemed to vibrate within the very marrow of the bone. Unteroffizier Klaus Mertens crouched in a shallow foxhole, his fingers so numb they felt like brittle wooden stakes fused to the frozen steel of his Kar 98K. Around him, the remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division were no longer a vanguard of a thousand-year Reich. They were hollow-eyed specters, shivering in tattered wool coats that offered no protection against the predatory bite of the Belgian winter. They had been told this final offensive, the Wacht am Rhein, would shatter the Allied line and force a peace that would save the fatherland. But as the fog began to lift, revealing the charred husks of King Tigers and the relentless silhouette of American Shermans cresting the ridge, the grand illusion of victory finally dissolved into the slush. The historical reality of the Battle of the Bulge was a collision between a dying empire's desperation and an industrial titan's awakening. For the German soldier, indoctrinated by years of Goebbels' propaganda, the American GI was portrayed as a soft, pampered product of a decadent democracy, a soldier who would crumble when faced with the iron will of the Aryan warrior. They expected a cowardly foe who would flee at the first sight of a bayonet. Instead, as the American 101st Airborne and the Third Army held their ground with a stubborn, almost casual ferocity, the Germans found themselves trapped in a tightening noose of steel. The ideology of racial superiority was being systematically dismantled by a logistical monster that never seemed to run out of shells, fuel, or men. By midday, the ammunition was gone. Klaus watched as his commander, a man who had survived the horrors of the Eastern Front, simply dropped his Luger into the snow and raised his hands. The American soldiers who swarmed over their position did not scream or bayonet the wounded as the German officers had warned. They moved with a businesslike efficiency, their uniforms thick and waterproof, their faces flushed with the health of a nation that had never known a famine. As Klaus was prodded toward a collection point, he felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. He waited for the inevitable execution, the mass grave that surely followed the loss of a battle. He looked at his feet, focusing on the rhythmic crunch of snow, waiting for the crack of a pistol. Instead of a bullet, Klaus felt a sudden weight in his lap as he was ordered to sit against a frozen embankment. An American private, barely old enough to shave, tossed a small, olive-drab rectangle toward him. It was a K-ration. With trembling hands, Klaus tore open the waxed cardboard. Inside was a marvel of industrial chemistry and abundance. Canned meat, crackers, and a small, sealed packet of cigarettes. But it was the small, wrapped square of chocolate that broke his composure. In Germany, chocolate had become a myth, a luxury reserved for the high command or the black market. Here, it was being thrown to a defeated enemy as a standard issue. The recurring sound of the war for Klaus had been the screech of Stukas. Now, it was the crinkle of cellophane, the sound of American production. This moment of capture was not merely a change in military status. It was the beginning of a profound psychological transformation. The German prisoners looked at one another, their faces smeared with oil and soot, seeing the reflection of a lie. They were the master race, yet they were starving, freezing, and defeated. Their captors, the decadent Americans, were handing out sweets and warm blankets. As the trucks arrived to ferry them toward the rear, Klaus looked back at the forest. The white snow was stained black by the soot of burned tanks, a funeral pyre for an ideology that could not feed its own. The terror remained, but beneath it, a seed of confusion was planted, a realization that the enemy possessed a weapon far more dangerous than the Sherman tank, a terrifying, bottomless capacity for forgiveness backed by unimaginable wealth. January 1945. The Belgian coastline at Antwerp was a landscape of jagged concrete and gray, churning surf, but it was dominated by something the German prisoners had never seen in such concentrated volume: the sheer industrial weight of the American war machine. As Klaus and his bedraggled comrades were marched toward the docks, the earth beneath their boots seemed to tremble not from explosions, but from the relentless motion of thousands of vehicles. To the German soldier, who had spent the last 2 years relying on horse-drawn carts for supply lines and scavenging for fuel, the sight was a physical blow to their remaining pride. They were witnessing the steel leviathan, a logistical miracle that defied every lecture they had ever heard regarding the supposed inefficiency of democracy. The historical context of the Allied ports in early 1945 was one of absolute material dominance. While the German industry was being systematically pounded into rubble by the 8th Air Force and the RAF, the American pipeline remained wide open, pouring an endless stream of resources across the Atlantic. The Germans watched in stunned silence as cranes, tall as cathedrals, swung crates of tanks, jeeps, and heavy artillery onto the docks as if they were toys. The data of the era supported their mounting dread. By this stage of the conflict, the United States was outproducing the Axis powers at a ratio that made any thought of German victory a mathematical impossibility. For Klaus, the realization was a cold, sinking sensation in his gut. They had been fighting a titan with a wooden sword. The emotional contrast was staggering. The German soldiers had been told that the American home front was in chaos, plagued by strikes and racial riots, and that the U.S. Navy was being strangled by the U-boat wolf packs. Yet, as they stood on the pier, the horizon was not empty. It was crowded with the silhouettes of hundreds of ships, from massive troop transports to nimble destroyers. There was no sign of the decadent weakness they had been promised. Instead, there was an atmosphere of calm, overwhelming competence. The American dockworkers and MPs moved with a casual confidence that was more intimidating than the fanaticism of the SS. It was the confidence of those who know they have already won.
As the prisoners were herded toward the gangplank of a massive Liberty ship, Klaus noticed a recurring detail that would haunt his thoughts for weeks. The American soldiers were not just well-equipped, they were wasteful. He watched a young American sergeant finish half of a chocolate bar and casually toss the remainder into a trash bin. To a man who had survived on ersatz, coffee made of acorns and bread extended with sawdust, this casual discard of calories was a revelation of power. It symbolized an abundance so vast that even its crumbs were more than the Reich could provide for its elite. The ship itself, a product of Henry Kaiser's assembly line genius, felt like a floating factory, humming with the vibration of engines that never seemed to tire. This exposure to the scale of Allied logistics began to erode the foundations of their indoctrination. The master race was standing in the shadow of a giant made of steel and oil. As Klaus climbed the steep metal stairs into the dark hold of the transport ship, the smell of salt air was replaced by the heavy, sweet scent of diesel and fresh paint. He realized that the war had not been lost in the forests of the Ardennes. It had been lost in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of Richmond. The ideology of the sword was being eclipsed by the ideology of the assembly line. As the heavy steel doors of the hold groaned shut, the darkness was not just a physical state, but the final closing of the chapter on their belief in a German-dominated world. The crossing of the Atlantic in the winter of 1945 was a journey through a void, a suspension of time where the past was a burning ruin and the future was a looming interrogation. Inside the belly of the Liberty ship, thousands of German prisoners were stacked in tiered canvas bunks that reached toward the low steel ceilings. The air was a thick, humid soup of salt spray, diesel fumes, and the unwashed scent of defeated men. For Klaus, the rhythmic groaning of the ship's hull against the swells of the North Atlantic became the heartbeat of his new reality. Each shudder of the vessel reminded him that he was being pulled further away from the scorched earth of Europe toward a continent he had been taught to despise as a land of soulless materialism. The historical evidence of these transport missions reveals a massive logistical undertaking. The U.S. Navy and Merchant Marine were moving tens of thousands of POWs monthly, treating them with a calculated adherence to the Geneva Convention that many Germans found baffling. In the mess halls below deck, The contrast between their former lives and their current captivity became a sensory shock. The prisoners were served hot meals twice a day, steaming trays of beef stew, powdered eggs, and canned peaches. To men who had spent years eating thin cabbage soup and hardtack biscuits, the richness of the food was physically overwhelming. Some of the younger soldiers became ill, their shrunken stomachs unable to process the sudden influx of protein and fats. The emotional weight of this transition was marked by a quiet, mounting tension between the prisoners. The die-hard National Socialists among them, often junior officers who had been promoted during the final desperate months of the war, attempted to maintain discipline and ideological purity. They whispered that the food was poisoned, or that it was a psychological trick meant to soften their resolve before they were sold into slavery. Klaus watched them with a growing sense of detachment. He looked at the American guards, young men who spent their shifts leaning against bulkheads, reading comic books or whistling popular tunes. There was no hatred in their eyes, only a sort of detached boredom that was more wounding to the German ego than any physical blow. The recurring symbol of American power manifested again in the form of a simple, silver-wrapped stick of Wrigley's spearmint gum. Klaus watched a guard peel the foil and pop the gum into his mouth with an air of casual indifference. It was a product of a civilian economy so robust that it could afford to manufacture and ship millions of such trivialities to every corner of the globe. In Germany, every scrap of rubber and ounce of sugar was diverted to the front, yet here was an entire culture built on the surplus of such things. To the Germans, the gum represented a society that did not need to choose between guns and butter. It simply produced both in staggering quantities. As the ship surged westward, the indoctrination of the master race continued to fray. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. Men who had once marched with iron-jawed conviction now sat in the dim light of the hold, sharing stories of home that no longer included talk of victory. They began to realize that the Americans did not hate them. They simply did not fear them. This lack of fear was the ultimate insult to the ideology of the Reich. The Americans were not conquering them with swords, but with a tidal wave of calories and consumer goods. By the time the ship neared the American coastline, the ideological armor of the captives had been punctured by the very abundance they had been told was a sign of Western rot. Late January 1945. The fog of the Atlantic began to thin, revealing a horizon that should not have existed according to the maps of the Reich. As the Liberty ship slowed its engines and drifted into New York Harbor, the German prisoners were permitted to come onto the deck in small groups. Klaus Mertens stood at the rail, his breath hitching in his chest. Before him lay a jagged silhouette of glass, steel, and stone, the Manhattan skyline. It was not a vista of smoke and rubble, but a soaring monument to industrial height and uncontained light. For men who had lived in the perpetual darkness of the blackout, where a single stray candle could draw a rain of British fire, the sight of a city vibrating with electric life was a crushing revelation. The historical reality of the American home front in 1945 was one of a nation operating at its absolute zenith. While every major city in Europe, from Berlin to London, was a patchwork of craters and boarded windows, the American ports were untouched. The prisoners gazed at the Statue of Liberty, not as a symbol of abstract freedom, but as a sentinel guarding a continent of infinite depth. The data was undeniable. The United States was the only major belligerent whose civilian economy actually grew during the conflict. As the ship docked, Klaus saw thousands of cars, private automobiles, clogging the streets near the piers. To a German soldier, a motor vehicle was a rare military asset. Here, it was a common tool for a dock worker to commute to a shift. The emotional contrast for the POWs was one of profound disorientation. They had been told that America was a dying civilization, a melting pot of discordant races that would collapse under the first strain of total war. Yet, as they were let off the ship, they saw a people who looked not stressed, but energized. The American civilians on the docks didn't look like the starving, desperate masses Goebbels had described. They looked well-fed, dressed in sturdy clothes, and, most disturbingly to the German psyche, they appeared largely indifferent to the presence of the conquerors in their midst. There was no vitriol, no stoning, just the cold, efficient processing of cargo. As the prisoners were marched toward a waiting train, Klaus noticed a recurring symbolic object that represented this new world's abundance, the electric light. It was midday, yet in many of the warehouses and offices, lights remained on, burning with a casual defiance of scarcity. In the Reich, energy was a word whispered with desperation, synonymous with coal shortages and stalled panzers. Here, it was a commodity, so cheap it was left on in empty rooms. This glow was more than a utility. It was a physical manifestation of an ideology that did not need to ration its essence to survive. The transformation within the men began to accelerate. The silent, stoic masks of the German soldiers started to crack as they realized the sheer scale of the deception they had lived under. They were not being taken to a failing state. They were being brought into the heart of an empire that had not even broken a sweat to defeat them. As Klaus stepped into the passenger coach of a train, not a cattle car, but a upholstered carriage with heating, he felt the weight of his own insignificance. The journey into the American interior was no longer a transit to a prison. It was a front-row seat to the funeral of his former worldview. The tracks clicked beneath them, a rhythmic countdown to the end of everything he thought he knew about power. February 1945. The train journeyed westward, leaving the coastal industry behind for a landscape that seemed to stretch into infinity. Klaus pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window as the locomotive cut through the heart of the American Midwest. Beyond the tracks lay the vast, rolling plains of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, eventually giving way to the golden expanses of Kansas. It was a horizon without end, a sea of dormant wheat and corn stalks bowing under a light dusting of snow. For a German soldier raised on the desperate concept of Lebensraum, the living space that Hitler claimed Germany must steal from the East to survive, the sight was a psychological hammer blow. The historical context of the American interior during the war was one of staggering productivity. While the black soil of Ukraine was being scorched and salted by retreating armies, the American breadbasket was feeding half the globe. Klaus watched as the train passed silos that rose like concrete cathedrals against the sky, each one holding enough grain to feed a division for a year. Factual records from the United States Department of Agriculture show that by 1945, American farmers had increased food production by 30% compared to pre-war levels, despite the labor shortage. To the prisoners, who had been told that Germany was a cramped nation destined to starve without conquest, the reality of Kansas was an indictment of their leaders. The emotional contrast inside the railcar was palpable. The men sat in a silence that was heavy with the weight of wasted years. They looked at the farmhouses, sturdy, painted structures with smoke curling peacefully from chimneys, and saw a life they had been told did not exist in the decadent West. There were no ruins here. There were no tank ditches or pillboxes. There was only the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a land that had never known the tread of a hostile boot. The German soldiers realized that the territory they had shed so much blood to seize in Russia was a pale, frozen shadow compared to the natural wealth rolling past their windows. A recurring symbol of this abundance appeared at every small-town station where the train paused to take on water: the red Coca-Cola vending machine. To the prisoners, the sight of a brightly painted machine dispensing a sugary, carbonated luxury to anyone with a nickel was a display of power more profound than a parade of tiger tanks. It represented a society where even the most mundane street corner offered a level of comfort that a German officer could not find in Berlin. The sound of the train's rhythmic clatter over the rails, asterisk click-clack, asterisk, seemed to mock them, repeating the word, abundance, abundance, abundance. This journey transformed the prisoners' perception of the American spirit. They saw that the American strength did not come from a central dictator's decree, but from the bottomless well of its geography and the industry of its free citizens. Klaus looked at his hands, scarred by the grit of the Ardennes, and then back at the endless fields. He realized that the living space the Reich had promised was a lie built on blood, while the reality before him was built on soil and freedom. As the train finally began to slow near the outskirts of a camp in the Kansas dust, the German ideology of conquest lay as dead as the stalks of winter wheat. They had arrived in the land of the giants they had been foolish enough to provoke. February 1945. The train hissed to a final halt in the vast, flat expanse of the Kansas prairie. As the heavy steel doors slid open, Klaus Mertens stepped out into a biting wind that smelled of dry earth and distant cedar. Before him lay Camp Aliceville, not the grim, gray fortress of his imagination, but a sprawling city of orderly wooden barracks, painted a crisp cream and organized with a geometric precision that rivaled any Prussian parade ground. There were no mass graves, no gallows, and no signs of the starvation he had been conditioned to expect. Instead, the sun glinted off the clean windows of an infirmary and the polished brass of the American Guard's belt buckles. The historical reality of the American POW camp system, overseen by the Provost Marshal General, was defined by a strict adherence to the Geneva Convention that often bordered on the surreal. While the world was reeling from the revelations of the atrocities in the East, the United States was housing nearly 425,000 German prisoners in over 500 camps across the interior. At Aliceville, the facilities included theaters, libraries, and even workshops for the arts. For Klaus and his men, the transition was a jarring reversal of everything they had known of military captivity. They were processed not as subhumans, but as guests of a sovereign power that had more resources than it knew what to do with. The emotional contrast within the camp was immediate. The German soldiers, still clutching their tattered dignity, were marched toward the shower blocks. Expecting the worst, they were instead met with the miracle of pressurized hot water and bars of fragrant, white soap. To a man who had spent months with the grime of the trenches etched into his skin, the sensation of heat and cleanliness was a spiritual experience. They emerged from the baths wrapped in clean, American-made denim work clothes, looking less like the vanguard of a master race and more like the farmers and mechanics they had been before the war consumed them. A recurring symbol of this newfound stability was the sound of the camp's morning whistle, not a frantic alarm for an air raid, but a steady, tonal signal for breakfast. It was the sound of a routine governed by law rather than whim. In the German camps, a whistle meant a selection or a beating. Here, it meant the beginning of a day where one's basic needs were met without question. The prisoners watched the guards, who were often older men or those unfit for frontline duty, as they sat in the guard towers smoking pipes and reading newspapers. The lack of tension was a weapon in itself, disarming the prisoners more effectively than any interrogation. This environment began a slow, agonizing transformation of the German ideology. The rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht began to soften under the weight of American pragmatism. Klaus noticed that his men no longer looked to their NCOs for every cue. They began to look at the camp's bulletin boards, which posted news of the Allied advance alongside menus for the week. The realization that they were being treated better by their enemies than they had been by their own retreating high command was a bitter pill to swallow. As Klaus lay in his bunk that first night, staring at the sturdy rafters of the barracks, he realized the golden cage of America was designed to break their spirits not through cruelty, but through a terrifying, orderly kindness. March 1945. The interior of the Camp Aliceville mess hall was a cavernous space of scrubbed pine and the low, rhythmic hum of 1,000 voices. Klaus Mertens stood in the serving line, his nostrils flaring at a scent he had forgotten existed, the smell of yeast, sugar, and toasted grain. As he reached the front, an American mess sergeant, wearing a clean white apron over his olive drab uniform, used a thick serrated knife to slice into a fresh loaf. It was not the dense, black, sawdust-heavy Kommissbrot of the Wehrmacht. It was a massive, airy rectangle of bleached white bread, so soft it seemed to defy gravity. The historical reality of the American food supply in 1945 was one of the greatest logistical triumphs in human history. While the citizens of the Third Reich were reduced to eating hunger bread made of potato flour and extenders, the United States was producing over 12 billion pounds of wheat annually. Factual records from the War Department show that POWs in American camps were provided with the same caloric intake as American servicemen, roughly 3,400 calories a day. To the German prisoners, this was a mathematical impossibility. They had been told the American merchant fleet was at the bottom of the Atlantic, yet here was a surplus of the finest flour, gifted to the very men who had tried to sink those ships. The emotional contrast was visible in the hands of the men. Klaus took his slice, feeling its unnatural lightness. When he pressed his thumb into the center, the bread sprang back into shape, a resilient, fluffy testament to a nation that had no need for substitutes. He saw his comrades staring at their plates in a state of near paralysis. Some of the older veterans, men who had fought in the meat grinder of Stalingrad, began to weep silently over their trays. It was not a grief born of pain, but of the sudden, crushing realization that they had been betrayed by their own leadership. They had been sent to conquer the world for a regime that could not even provide a decent crust, while their inferior enemies had so much they could afford to be extravagant. The white bread loaf became the recurring symbol of American abundance and the democratic spirit. It was the antithesis of the Iron Cross. One represented a culture of sacrifice and death, the other represented a culture of production and life. The bread was white because the Americans had the luxury of refining it. It was plentiful because they had the freedom to farm it. Every bite Klaus took was a dissolution of his former ideology. He realized that a nation that could feed its prisoners better than the Reich fed its generals was a nation that could never be defeated by force of arms. This miracle of the loaf transformed the camp's social fabric. The aggressive posture of the hardline Nazis began to look increasingly ridiculous in the face of such overwhelming hospitality. The bread was a silent, edible argument for the American way of life, an argument that required no translation and no propaganda. As Klaus chewed the soft, sweet grain, he felt the last remnants of his fanaticism being replaced by a profound, hollow shame. The war of ideologies was over in that mess hall. The bread had won. He sat among his silent countrymen, realizing that the greatest weapon the Americans possessed was not the bomb or the tank, but the simple, unearned gift of a full stomach. April 1945. The spring sun began to thaw the Kansas soil, turning the vast horizons into a vibrant, pulsing green. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, which allowed for the labor of non-commissioned officers and privates, Klaus Mertens and his platoon were assigned to work details in the surrounding counties. They were loaded into open-backed trucks and driven to local farms to assist with the spring planting and the maintenance of agricultural machinery. For Klaus, the experience was a surreal immersion into the heart of the society he had been told was his mortal enemy. He found himself standing in the middle of a vast wheat field, the wind whipping his denim work jacket as he looked at a world that functioned without the shadow of a secret police. The historical evidence of the POW labor program in the United States reveals a unique moment of cultural intersection. Between 1943 and 1945, German prisoners contributed millions of man-hours to the American agricultural sector, filling the void left by millions of young American men serving overseas. Factual records indicate that these prisoners were paid in canteen coupons, roughly 80 cents a day, which they could use to buy luxuries like cigarettes or chocolate. To Klaus, the concept of being paid for his labor while in captivity was a jarring contradiction. In the East, he had seen how the Reich treated its captives. They were worked until they collapsed and then discarded. Here, he was a laborer with rights, protected by a system that valued the rule of law over the whim of a commander. The emotional contrast reached its peak during the midday breaks. The American farmers, often older men with weathered faces and calloused hands, did not treat the Germans with the vitriol of a victor. Instead, there was a stern, quiet pragmatism. Klaus remembered a specific afternoon when the farmer he was working for, a man named Miller, approached him with a galvanized steel bucket filled with ice and glass bottles of milk. Miller didn't say much. He simply gestured for the men to drink. The German soldiers sat in the shade of a massive red barn, passing around the cold milk, stunned by the absence of hatred. They were the enemy, yet they were being treated with a basic, human decency that made their own previous actions in Europe feel increasingly monstrous. The recurring symbol of this interaction was the American handshake. It happened rarely, and usually at the end of a long day of hard labor, but it represented the ultimate subversion of Nazi ideology. When Miller reached out to steady Klaus as he climbed off a tractor, or when a civilian foreman nodded in approval at a job well done, it was a recognition of shared humanity. This simple gesture of physical contact, man to man, rather than master to slave, shattered the myth of the Untermensch. It proved that the American strength was not rooted in the suppression of others, but in a cooperative, individualistic drive that the German soldiers had never been allowed to experience. This period of labor transformed Klaus's internal landscape. He realized that the American forgiveness he was experiencing was not a sign of weakness, but a byproduct of immense confidence. The Americans could afford to be kind because their system was fundamentally more resilient than the one Klaus had fought to defend. As the sun set over the Kansas plains, casting long, purple shadows across the furrows of the earth, Klaus felt a profound sense of relief. The war was still raging in the ruins of Berlin, but here, in the dirt of a foreign land, he was discovering a version of himself that was no longer a cog in a machine. He was becoming a man again, forged in the fires of American abundance and the quiet grace of his captors. May 1945. The news of the unconditional surrender of the German Reich rippled through Camp Aliceville not with a roar, but with a heavy, suffocating silence. In the barracks, the atmosphere turned toxic as the inner war reached its boiling point. For Klaus Mertens, the collapse of his nation was mirrored by a violent schism within the wire. The camp was divided between the hardliners, mostly SS officers and paratroopers who remained fanatically devoted to a dead Führer, and the realists, who had seen the white bread, the Kansas wheat, and the American spirit, and realized they had been led into a moral abyss. The historical reality of the post-surrender period was one of intense re-education and internal purging. The U.S. Army, recognizing the ideological rot within the prisoner population, began to separate the black, Ardennes Nazis, from the white, anti-Nazis or neutrals, through a series of psychological screenings and town hall-style meetings. Factual records from the period show that the Americans used German-language newspapers, like Der Ruf, and screenings of films depicting the liberation of concentration camps to confront the prisoners with the crimes committed in their name. For Klaus, watching the grainy, black and white footage of the camps was the final, agonizing death of his pride. The contrast between the mercy he had received in Kansas and the cruelty his nation had inflicted on others was a burden that threatened to crush his soul. The emotional conflict manifested in the dark corners of the barracks. The hardliners branded any man who spoke well of the Americans a traitor, sometimes organizing kangaroo courts to beat or intimidate the realists. Klaus found himself cornered one evening by a former sergeant who demanded he spit on his American work pay. Klaus looked at the man, a gaunt, hollow-eyed fanatic clutching a worn photograph of Berlin, and felt only a profound, weary pity. The ideological armor of the Reich had not just been pierced, it had been revealed as a hollow shell that offered no warmth, only a cold, rigid cage. The recurring symbol of this internal struggle was the canteen coupon. These small slips of paper, earned through honest labor on American farms, became the currency of the New World. To the hardliners, the coupons were the 30 pieces of silver for which their comrades had sold their souls. To Klaus and the realists, they were symbols of a meritocratic society where a man was defined by his work rather than his bloodline. Holding the thin paper in his hand, Klaus realized it represented a fundamental truth about democracy. It rewarded the individual's contribution to life, whereas his former ideology had only demanded his contribution to death. This inner war was the true defeat of the National Socialist spirit. It was not a defeat administered by a firing squad, but by the undeniable evidence of a better way of life. Klaus chose to step across the barracks floor, away from the shadows of the fanatics, and into the light of the white contingent. He was choosing a future defined by the forgiveness he had seen in the eyes of Farmer Miller and the abundance of the Kansas plains. As the swastika was lowered across the world, the men in Camp Aliceville were being reborn, not as conquerors, but as humans who had finally learned that true power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to provide and forgive. June 1946. The dust of the Kansas plains swirled around the tires of the trucks as they lined up for the final departure from Camp Aliceville. Klaus Mertens stood by the gate, his small cardboard suitcase containing a few personal items and his remaining canteen coupons. He looked back at the rows of cream-colored barracks one last time. The wire was still there, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like the perimeter of a sanctuary where his soul had been salvaged from the wreckage of a failed civilization. He was being repatriated to a Germany that was now a map of 4 occupied zones, a land of hunger and rubble, yet he was returning with a wealth that no customs officer could seize. The historical reality of the repatriation process was a bittersweet transition. While many German POWs were transferred to labor camps in Britain or France to assist with reconstruction, those who returned directly to Germany carried with them the seeds of a new democratic identity. Factual records from the Office of Military Government for Germany, OMGS, suggest that the graduates of American POW camps became pivotal figures in the rebuilding of the West German state. They had seen the machinery of freedom up close. They had lived within a system where the victor did not seek to annihilate the vanquished, but to feed them, pay them, and eventually set them free. The emotional reflection of the men as they boarded the trains for the coast was one of quiet, profound gratitude. The master race was gone, replaced by a generation of men who had been humbled by the soft interior of a white bread loaf and the steady gaze of a Kansas farmer. Klaus remembered the fear he had felt in the snow of the Ardennes, expecting a bullet to the back of the head. Instead, he had been given a second life. He thought of the American Guards, the abundance of the mess halls, and the vast, unscarred horizons of the Midwest. The American forgiveness had not been an act of weakness, it had been the ultimate display of moral and material superiority. The recurring symbol of his journey reached its final iteration in the seed. As Klaus sat in the train, he reached into his pocket and felt a few dried grains of Kansas wheat he had kept from the harvest. To him, they represented the larger truth of his captivity. The Americans had not just conquered Germany, they had planted something in its soldiers. They had planted the idea that abundance is the fruit of liberty and that a nation's greatness is measured by how it treats the most helpless in its care. The epilogue of this historical narrative is written in the piece that followed. The German POWs who trembled at the sight of American forgiveness went on to build a nation that rejected the sword for the plowshare. Klaus Mertens looked out at the passing American landscape, realizing that while the Reich had promised 1,000 years of glory through war, the Americans had delivered a future through the simple, revolutionary act of mercy. The larger truth of freedom was not found in the thunder of the artillery, but in the silence of a full stomach and the hand reached out in peace to a fallen foe. The abundance of the American heart had proved more durable than the steel of the German tank, proving for all time that the most effective way to destroy an enemy is to make him a witness to your humanity.